My brother dragged me to meet his fiancée's multimillionaire father at the wedding, smirking as he called me the family failure. My parents eagerly chimed in, telling the billionaire they never brag about me. The wealthy man just looked at me. He froze completely and said quietly, "So it is you. This is unexpected." I am Alyssa, 33 years old, and my family had no idea that the man they were trying to impress was actually my biggest client. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who constantly underestimated your worth. The crystal chandeliers of the exclusive Aspen Mountain Resort cast a warm golden glow over the rehearsal dinner, but the atmosphere at my particular table was absolutely freezing. We were sitting in a VIP private dining room, surrounded by towering floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the jagged snow-covered peaks. Waiters in crisp white uniforms moved silently around the room, pouring vintage champagne for the bridal party and ensuring every crystal glass remained full. I was quietly eating my salad, trying my best to remain invisible and get through the evening without an incident. That quiet strategy failed the moment a heavy leather checkbook slammed down directly onto my plate. The impact shattered the quiet ambiance of our corner, splattering vinaigrette across the pristine white tablecloth and onto my hands. Before I could even process what had just happened, a thick stapled legal document was thrown down right next to the checkbook. I looked up to see my older brother Connor looming over my chair. He was 36 years old, dressed in a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost more than my first car, and wearing his usual expression of arrogant entitlement. He crossed his arms and looked down his nose at me. "Pay this!" Connor demanded, aggressively tapping the leather checkbook with his index finger. "It is the liquor bill for the bridal party's table. $15,000. Since you are just taking up space here and ruining the elegant aesthetic of my wedding weekend, you can finally make yourself useful to the family." I stared at the astronomical bill, then shifted my gaze to the intimidating legal document beside it. "What is this other paper?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly steady despite the sudden furious spike in my heart rate. Connor smirked, shifting his weight confidently. "That is a legal waiver releasing your 10% share of our late grandmother's trust fund. You are going to sign it right now and transfer your entire portion to me as a wedding gift." My fiancée Nia and her father belong to a highly respected, elite African-American family. They are accustomed to a certain standard of luxury. I need that extra cash to put a down payment on a massive mansion in the hills so I can give her the life she truly deserves. Before I could even formulate a response to his sheer audacity, my mother Susan leaned across the table. Her face was tight with intense disapproval, her heavy diamond necklace catching the chandelier light as she glared at me with absolute disdain. "Sign the document." "Alyssa," my mother sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Ever since you selfishly dropped out of your MBA program to go play handywoman and install cheap alarm systems for paranoid widows, you completely lost your privileges in this family. Look at your brother. Connor is a project director at Pierce Corp now. He actually made something of himself. He needs that trust fund money much more than a glorified security guard ever will." My father Bradley swirled the expensive red wine in his glass and nodded in firm agreement, without even bothering to look at me. "Your mother is completely right. You have been a continuous embarrassment to this family since you quit business school to pursue blue-collar labor. We only invited you to Aspen out of pity. The absolute least you can do is sign the paper and pay the bar tab so Connor and Nia can enjoy their beautiful weekend without your financial misery dragging everyone down. Do not dare make a scene and ruin this for your brother." I looked at the three of them in utter disbelief. My own flesh and blood. For years they had treated my career choice as a running punchline at every holiday gathering. When I walked away from a traditional corporate path, they immediately labeled me the black sheep and cut me off emotionally. They genuinely thought I was driving around in a rusty van, climbing ladders and installing cheap doorbell cameras. They had absolutely no idea that my company, Aegis Spatial, was an ultra-exclusive, hyper-secure smart fortress tech firm. I designed invisible military-grade security systems and subterranean bunkers for billionaires and high-profile executives across the globe. I operated entirely under the alias A. Thorne to maintain maximum operational security for my elite clients. I was not broke. I was exponentially wealthier than all of them combined. I reached into my designer clutch, completely ignoring the legal waiver. I pulled out my solid metal American Express Centurion card. The heavy black titanium card made a distinct sharp clinking sound as I dropped it onto the leather checkbook. "I will pay for the liquor," I said calmly, looking Connor dead in the eye. "Consider it my one and only contribution to this circus of a wedding, but I am not giving you a single dime of my inheritance." With a swift, fluid motion, I picked up the thick legal waiver, ripped it straight down the middle, and dropped the torn pieces directly onto the floor at his expensive leather shoes. My mother gasped loudly, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically struck by my defiance. My father finally looked at me, his face rapidly turning an angry shade of purple as he set his wineglass down with a harsh thud. Connor stared at the torn paper on the floor, his smug, entitled expression instantly dissolving into pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged forward, grabbing a full glass of red wine from the center of the table. With a vicious, aggressive flick of his wrist, he hurled the dark liquid directly at me. The cold wine splashed heavily across my chest, soaking instantly into the delicate fabric of my silk dress and dripping down my neck in sticky red streaks. "Where did you steal that credit card?" Connor roared, his voice booming through the private dining room and causing several wealthy guests at nearby tables to turn their heads in absolute shock. "I know exactly how much your pathetic little alarm company makes. I will have you arrested for credit card fraud right here and now before the wedding even starts." The silence in the private dining room was deafening. You could hear a pin drop on the thick carpet. Connor stood there with his chest heaving as the red wine dripped from my silk dress and pooled on the polished hardwood floor. Before I could even wipe the liquid from my face, the sharp click of stiletto heels broke the tension. Nia stepped into our section of the room. She was an absolute vision, a highly educated corporate lawyer who moved with the effortless grace of someone born into wealth. Her Vera Wang rehearsal gown draped perfectly around her frame. Her intelligent eyes scanned the scene, immediately calculating the damage. She looked at the torn legal document on the floor, the heavy black credit card sitting on the leather checkbook, and then the dark red stains ruining my dress. "What is going on here?" Nia asked. Her voice was calm but carried an undeniable authority. Connor pivoted faster than a seasoned actor. The red-faced bully who had just assaulted me completely vanished. In his place stood a wounded, exhausted older brother. He stepped over the torn paper and gently placed his hands on Nia's shoulders, letting out a heavy theatrical sigh. "It is just Alyssa having another one of her episodes," Connor said loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I am so sorry you have to see this baby. I told my parents it was a risk bringing her here. She just threw a massive tantrum because we asked her to cover a simple bar tab. She pulled out a fake or stolen credit card to try and show off. You know how she gets. She is completely broke, deeply unstable, and constantly trying to fund her delusions of grandeur by stealing from the family." I stood perfectly still, letting the cold wine soak through to my skin. I did not scream. I did not cry. Decades of their emotional abuse had forged my patience out of pure steel. I just watched my brother casually assassinate my character to protect his own ego. My father Bradley eagerly stepped forward to reinforce the lie. He physically placed himself between me and Nia, acting as a human shield against his supposedly deranged daughter. "Please do not mind her, Nia," my father said, using his most soothing paternal voice. "We are deeply embarrassed. Alyssa has been bitterly jealous of Connor for years. Ever since Connor pioneered that brilliant new cybersecurity infrastructure for your father's company, her resentment has morphed into an ugly sickness. She dropped out of her own program, and now she spends her days pretending she is some sort of elite tech expert. We try our best to hide her away for her own good, but she insists on causing these humiliating public scenes whenever Connor receives any well-deserved attention." My mother Susan nodded vigorously behind him, clutching her hands to her chest in fake agony. "We have tried to get her psychiatric help, Nia. We really have. We paid for therapists, but she refuses to accept reality. She hates seeing Connor so successful and happy with a beautiful woman like you. Please just ignore her. The resort security will handle this in a moment." The sheer volume of their lies was almost impressive. My own father was standing in a room full of Aspen's elite, boldly claiming that my brother had engineered the Aegis spatial network. The very network I had written from scratch in my cramped apartment years ago. Connor had not pioneered anything. He barely understood basic firewalls. But he had stolen my early prototype drives and presented them as his own genius to Pierce Corp, using my stolen intellect to secure his plush executive job and impress Nia's billionaire father. Nia looked at me. Her dark eyes were piercing, analyzing my posture, my stained dress, and my unblinking expression. She was a woman who dealt with high-stakes corporate litigation daily. She knew what a frantic, unstable person looked like, and I was giving her nothing but absolute unnerving calm. I did not waste a single breath defending myself to my parents. Defending yourself to abusers only validates their false reality. Instead, I bypassed my father entirely and locked eyes with the bride. "That is a truly beautiful Vera Wang gown, Nia," I said. My voice was smooth, completely unaffected by the wine dripping from my chin. "The bias cut is exquisite. You have incredible taste." Connor sneered, stepping forward again. "Shut your mouth, Alyssa. Do not speak to her." I ignored him completely, keeping my eyes fixed on Nia. I tilted my head slightly, focusing my gaze down to her left hand, where a massive, glittering diamond rested on her ring finger. "You clearly appreciate the finer things, Nia," I continued, taking a slow step forward. "But you really should have an independent jeweler appraise that engagement ring." Connor froze. His entire body went rigid. Nia frowned instinctively, bringing her hand closer to her chest. "Excuse me," she asked her lawyer. Instincts instantly flaring up, I pointed directly at the ring. "The center stone has a laser-drilled flaw right beneath the lower left prong. It is a clever setting trick designed to hide the imperfections of a synthetic creation. It is a decent piece of costume jewelry, but it is a $4,000 lab-grown fake. It is definitely not the $200,000 vintage family heirloom Connor claimed he bought for you." The silence that fell over the room this time was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a devastating explosion. Nia stopped breathing. She looked down at her hand, her thumb slowly brushing over the left prong of the diamond. As a woman who grew up surrounded by authentic wealth, the sudden seed of doubt I planted hit her like a physical strike. She knew I had no reason to lie about something so specific, so easily verifiable. My mother let out a strangled gasp. My father looked completely bewildered. But Connor was the true spectacle. All the arrogant color violently drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a custom tuxedo. His jaw worked silently, trying to form words, trying to conjure another lie, but his sheer panic betrayed him. He knew that I knew. He knew his perfect wealthy facade was beginning to crack right down the middle, starting with the fake diamond on his fiancé's finger. Nia lifted her left hand toward the glowing crystal chandelier above us. Her sharp corporate lawyer instincts overrode her shock. She narrowed her dark eyes, rotating the band slowly in the light. Her manicured thumbnail traced the platinum setting, stopping exactly at the lower left prong, where the laser-drilled flaw was hidden. The brilliant sparkle she had admired all evening suddenly looked flat and artificial. Connor completely lost his mind. The carefully constructed mask of the wealthy, successful groom shattered into a million pieces. He spun around and screamed across the room at the two Aspen Resort security guards stationed near the entrance. "Get this lunatic out of here right now." Connor pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is trespassing on a private event. She is harassing my fiancé. I want her physically removed and arrested for causing a disturbance." The guards exchanged a tense look and began marching briskly toward our table. I did not move a single inch. I stood my ground, calmly wiping a stray drop of Connor's thrown wine from my collar. I watched my older brother unravel in real time. "She is sick in the head," Connor babbled, turning back to Nia and frantically reaching for her hand. "Baby, listen to me. Do not listen to a single word she says. I bought that ring from an exclusive dealer in Antwerp. She is just a bitter dropout trying to ruin the happiest weekend of our lives because she installs cheap burglar alarms for a living." Nia pulled her hand away from his grasp. She did not yell. She just stared at him with an expression of pure, calculating ice. Before the resort security could lay a hand on my shoulder, The massive oak double doors of the private dining room swung open with a thunderous crack. The entire room went dead silent. Reginald Pierce strode into the room. Nia's father was an imposing self-made billionaire who had built a global tech and real estate empire from absolutely nothing. He radiated absolute power. He was flanked by four massive men in dark tailored suits, his elite personal security detail. The moment they stepped into the room, the Aspen Resort guards instantly backed away, completely intimidated by the sheer presence of Pierce's men. My parents practically tripped over themselves to reach him. The moment Reginald walked in, Bradley and Susan abandoned their venomous glaring at me and sprinted across the dining room like desperate fans at a concert. "Mr. Pierce, what an absolute honor!" Bradley announced aggressively, extending his hand to shake the billionaire's hand. "The resort is simply magnificent. We are so incredibly thrilled to merge our families this weekend. Connor has made us so proud working under your brilliant leadership at Pierce Corp." Susan flanked him, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Your suit is impeccable, Reginald. We are just so blessed. Everything is perfect. Just a flawless evening for two flawless young people." They were sweating through their forced smiles, terrified that the billionaire would notice the wine dripping from my dress or the heavy tension suffocating the room. Connor realized his window of opportunity was closing. He saw Nia looking at the ring and knew he had to completely destroy my credibility. Before Nia could speak a single word to her powerful father, he lunged at me, his large hand clamped down hard on my upper arm. His fingers dug painfully into my skin as he aggressively yanked me forward. "Let go of me, Connor," I said, my voice low and dangerous. He ignored me forcefully, dragging me across the thick carpet directly into the path of Reginald Pierce. He shoved me forward slightly, positioning me like a criminal being presented to a judge. He plastered on his most charming, subservient smile, though his forehead was shining with nervous sweat. "Mr. Pierce, I offer my deepest apologies for the disruption," Connor said, his voice dripping with fake humility. "I am so sorry you had to walk into this mess. This is my sister Alyssa. She is our family failure." I felt a flash of heat in my chest, but I kept my face entirely blank. Connor tightened his grip on my arm. "She is deeply unstable, sir. She has been throwing a massive, embarrassing tantrum all evening. She is completely broke and bitterly jealous of the fact that I pioneered the new cybersecurity infrastructure for your corporation. She has been trying to extort money from us all night. Please do not pay attention to anything she says. She is a known liar." My father nodded eagerly, desperate to secure his son's position with the billionaire. "It is the sad truth, Mr. Pierce. We do not even brag about her to our friends. We try to keep her away from important events, but she insisted on showing up just to cause a scene. She is an absolute embarrassment to the family name." Reginald Pierce stopped walking. He did not smile. He did not acknowledge my father's groveling. And he did not even look at Connor's sweating, desperate face. Instead, Reginald's sharp eyes dropped directly to my left wrist. I was wearing a heavy brushed titanium smartwatch. It was not a commercial brand. It was a custom-engineered device I had designed myself in the underground lab of my company. It possessed military-grade encryption, satellite uplinks, and biometric locks. Reginald stared at the unique bezel of the watch. His imposing posture suddenly went completely rigid. The formidable billionaire froze in his tracks. He slowly raised his eyes, ignoring Connor completely. He stepped right past my brother, treating the golden boy like empty air. He closed the distance between us until he was standing just inches away from me. The entire dining room watched in breathless silence as the billionaire looked at my wine-stained dress, my calm face, and finally my titanium watch. Reginald Pierce stepped closer, entirely ignoring my brother's sweaty grip on my arm. The billionaire reached out his massive hand, hovering just inches above my wrist. He was staring directly at the brushed titanium face of my custom smartwatch. The silence in the VIP dining room grew so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. No one dared to speak or move as the most powerful man in Aspen inspected my jewelry. His voice dropped to a low, deeply respectful murmur that carried across the frozen room. "An Aegis Chronos Alpha." He slowly pulled back the cuff of his own bespoke tailored jacket, revealing an identical titanium timepiece on his left wrist. Only 2 of these exist in the entire world. I wear one, and the other belongs exclusively to the elusive founder of the company. Reginald looked up from my wrist, his sharp eyes meeting mine. A profound realization washed over his features. So it is you. This is highly unexpected, a thorn. I did not flinch. I simply nodded, maintaining perfect eye contact with the man who had anonymously paid my company millions over the last 4 years. Connor dropped my arm as if he had been burned by a hot iron. He looked frantically back and forth between his billionaire boss and my wine-stained silk dress. He let out a nervous, high-pitched chuckle, trying desperately to regain control of the narrative he had spent years building. "Mr. Pierce, I think there is a huge misunderstanding here," Connor babbled, his hands shaking slightly. "This is Alyssa. She installs cheap burglar alarms for residential homes. She is a college dropout. She does not even know how to write basic code. She certainly does not own a watch like that. She probably bought a cheap replica online to try and impress your guests." Reginald pivoted on his heel. His 6'2" frame towered over my brother. The sudden shift in the billionaire's demeanor was terrifying to witness. He was no longer the gracious father of the bride hosting a lavish wedding weekend. He was the ruthless corporate titan who had built an empire and crushed entire conglomerates along the way. "Failure!" Reginald boomed, his voice echoing like thunder off the vaulted ceilings of the Aspen Resort. "You are standing in front of my elite guests and calling this woman a failure." He pointed a heavy dominant finger directly at my chest. "This woman single-handedly engineered the invisible smart fortress systems for all of my global properties. She designed the subterranean security grids protecting my most valuable data centers in Manhattan and Dubai. She is the anonymous genius behind Aegis Spatial, a hyper-secure technology company currently valued at over $2 billion. And you have the absolute audacity to stand in my presence and call her a failure." My mother physically stumbled backward, knocking over a crystal champagne flute. It shattered sharply against the hardwood floor, but no one in the room even blinked. Susan grabbed the edge of the dining table, gasping for air, as her mind tried to process the astronomical numbers Reginald had just spoken. $2 billion. The daughter she had relentlessly mocked all evening, the child she had just ordered to pay a $15,000 bar tab, was a billionaire. For years my mother had told her country club friends I was a lost cause working a dead-end blue-collar job. Now she was staring at the most powerful and wealthy woman in the room, and the realization was choking her. Nia stood perfectly still, her sharp lawyer gaze darting between my completely unbothered expression and Connor's rapidly deteriorating composure. She knew exactly what was unfolding in front of her. A massive corporate lie was being brutally exposed right in the middle of her rehearsal dinner. The man she was supposed to marry tomorrow was sweating through his tuxedo looking like a trapped animal. But my father Bradley could not accept this reality. His golden boy was being actively threatened. His fragile ego could not comprehend a world where the daughter he openly discarded had achieved more than his precious, successful son. For decades, Bradley had funded Connor's lavish lifestyle, paying off his constant debts and celebrating his highly mediocre achievements. He stepped forward, his face flushed red with stubborn arrogance. He actually held up his hands, attempting to confidently correct the billionaire who signed his son's paychecks. "Sir, you are clearly confused," Bradley said with a nervous, patronizing laugh. "I know you are an incredibly busy man, and you meet a lot of contractors, but you have your facts completely mixed up. Alyssa does not own any tech company. She dropped out of her MBA program to run wire through drywall. Connor is the one who submitted the Aegis protocol to your corporation. He brought that groundbreaking software to Pierce Corp. He worked nights and weekends in our family basement to perfect that code. That is exactly why you promoted him to project director 6 months ago. My son is the true tech genius of this family. Alyssa is just trying to ride his coattails because she is bitter and broke." The entire room inhaled a collective sharp breath. The waitstaff stopped moving completely. The musicians in the corner lowered their instruments. Reginald Pierce slowly turned his head away from my father. He locked his piercing dark eyes onto Connor. The temperature in the room instantly dropped to sub-zero. The silence was deafening as Reginald stared at my brother, waiting for an explanation that Connor could not possibly provide. Reginald Pierce did not blink. He stood absolutely motionless, his dark, calculating eyes locked onto Connor with the intensity of a predator studying a particularly pathetic prey. The air in the exclusive private dining room felt incredibly thin, as if the billionaire's sheer presence was sucking the oxygen right out of the room. The elegant string quartet in the corner had completely stopped playing. The elite waitstaff stood frozen against the walls. "Explain yourself," Reginald commanded. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, terrifyingly calm rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Connor began to physically shake. The confident, arrogant executive who had just violently hurled a glass of wine at my chest was entirely gone. In his place was a terrified, stammering fraud caught in the blinding glare of a spotlight. He looked desperately at Nia, hoping his beautiful, brilliant fiancée would throw him a legal lifeline, but Nia had taken 3 large steps away from him. She crossed her arms, her sharp eyes narrowed in intense scrutiny. "Sir, it is just a misunderstanding." Connor choked out, his voice cracking horribly. "My father was just speaking out of turn. He does not understand the nuances of corporate tech development. I led the team that integrated the protocol. I managed the rollout. My sister has nothing to do with this. She is just trying to extort me because she is jealous of my success and my relationship with your daughter." Reginald slowly turned his gaze toward my father Bradley, who was currently sweating through his expensive tailored suit. Bradley swallowed hard, suddenly realizing he had spoken entirely out of turn to a man who could financially ruin him with a single phone call. Susan clutched Bradley's arm, her face chalk white. She looked back and forth between the billionaire and my wine-stained silk dress, her mind frantically trying to process the catastrophic shift in the room's power dynamic. I decided it was time to end the pathetic charade. "He cannot explain the Aegis protocol to you, Mr. Pierce," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence with lethal precision. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, wiping a final drop of red wine from my collar. "He cannot explain it because he does not understand the foundational architecture of the very system he claims to have built." Connor spun around, his face twisted in pure, desperate rage. "Shut up!" he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Security, get her out of here. She is a liar and a thief." Reginald simply raised one large, heavy hand. The gesture was incredibly slight, but it held the force of a concrete wall. Connor's jaw snapped shut instantly. Reginald's elite security detail took a synchronized step forward, their hands resting subtly near their waistbands. The message was clear: nobody touches Alyssa. I reached into my designer clutch. Connor flinched, genuinely terrified of what I was going to pull out next. I withdrew my sleek, custom-engineered smartphone. It possessed no branding, no recognizable logo. It was a solid block of matte black titanium running on a proprietary operating system that I had built from the ground up. I tapped the face of my Aegis Chronos Alpha smartwatch, wirelessly syncing my device to the Aspen Resort's central network. What my family did not know, what nobody in that room besides Reginald Pierce knew, was that Aegis Spatial had secured the contract to upgrade the entire resort's back-end infrastructure 6 months ago. The very walls surrounding us were running on my software. I executed a bypass command on my screen. Instantly, the heavy crystal chandeliers above us dimmed to a dramatic theater-like low. The wealthy guests gasped in shock as the ambient lighting shifted. The massive floor-to-ceiling smart glass windows that looked out over the snow-covered peaks immediately tinted to opaque black, plunging the room into shadows. With a smooth, mechanized hum, 3 massive projection screens descended from the vaulted wooden ceiling surrounding our dining table like a high-tech coliseum. Connor stumbled backward, crashing into a dining chair. His eyes were wide with unadulterated terror. Nia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized the sheer level of technological control I possessed over the environment. My mother let out a terrified squeak, clutching her pearl necklace as if the world was ending. My father looked completely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open in silent shock. I cast my screen directly to the massive displays. Lines of complex, densely packed code began scrolling rapidly across the 3 screens, glowing a sharp, vibrant blue in the darkened room. The sheer volume of the data was staggering, flying past at a dizzying speed, before locking into a stable, highly organized architectural framework. "This," I announced, my voice echoing clearly through the silenced room, is the core structural architecture of the Aegis Spatial Protocol. This is the exact same proprietary framework Connor presented to the Pierce Corp Board of Directors 2 years ago. This is the exact code he leveraged to secure his executive promotion, his plush corner office, and a multi-million-dollar departmental budget. Reginald stepped closer to the screens. The billionaire stood perfectly still, his eyes darting across the glowing lines of code. He recognized it instantly. It was the very lifeblood of his global empire, the invisible shield that protected his corporate data centers, his private estates, and his international communications. Connor began to hyperventilate. He lunged wildly toward the audiovisual control panel on the far wall, desperate to shut the screens down, but Reginald's lead security guard intercepted him effortlessly. The massive guard grabbed Connor by the front of his tuxedo, effortlessly lifting him onto his toes before shoving him forcefully back into his chair. "Sit down and stay quiet," the guard growled, standing directly over my brother. I stepped right in front of Connor's chair, forcing him to look at me. I dropped my quiet, accommodating demeanor entirely. Connor did not write a single line of that code. I stated my words, hitting him like physical blows. I turned to look directly at Reginald, who was listening with absolute terrifying focus. 3 years ago, Mr. Pierce, my parents, hosted a holiday dinner. They spent the entire evening doing exactly what they tried to do tonight. They mocked me. They humiliated me. They called me a failure and a disappointment because I had abandoned a traditional corporate path to start my own company. I gestured toward my shrinking, terrified parents. Bradley and Susan physically recoiled, looking like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. While they were busy taking turns destroying my character in the dining room, Connor sneaked into my old bedroom. I continued pacing slowly beneath the glowing blue screens. Connor was failing at his mid-level tech job. He was drowning in debt and desperate for a miracle to save his pathetic career. He found my encrypted hard drive sitting on my desk. He stole my early algorithms, took my life's work, slapped his name on the presentation file, and handed it directly to your company. Connor violently shook his head, tears of panic streaming down his face. He looked at Nia, begging for salvation. "She is lying, Nia. I swear to God she is a vindictive, psychotic liar. I wrote that system. It was my genius. She is just trying to destroy us." Nia did not move toward him. She looked at the screens, then at me, her sharp legal mind rapidly assembling the pieces of a massive corporate fraud case. I did not raise my voice. I simply offered a cold, calculated smile that made my brother shrink further into his chair. "You stole my drives, Connor," I said softly. "But you were too fundamentally arrogant and far too stupid to realize what you were actually stealing. You did not take the finalized operational Aegis protocol." I paused, letting the silence stretch out for maximum impact. "You took an obsolete, highly unstable beta version. It was a discarded rough draft that I had planned to wipe because it contained critical structural vulnerabilities." Reginald Pierce inhaled sharply. The billionaire's imposing frame stiffened. He instantly understood the catastrophic implications of integrating a vulnerable, unstable security system into a global corporate network. Nia let out a sharp gasp of horror, her hands trembling as she realized the man she almost married was a fraudulent thief who had actively endangered her father's entire empire. "If you actually understood the code you stole, Connor," I said, lifting my titanium phone again, "you would have known how to read the foundational root files. You would have known to check the deepest layers of the architecture before presenting it to a billionaire." I executed a single final command on my screen. The massive projections instantly shifted. The rapid scrolling lines of blue code suddenly stopped entirely. The text violently zoomed in, isolating a very specific, heavily encrypted string of characters buried deep within the system's core architecture. The lines of code rapidly reformatted, stripping away the operational commands to reveal a hidden, undeniable text block. It was a digital watermark. It was permanently embedded into the very foundation of the software Connor had claimed as his own brilliant creation. It was entirely impossible to remove without collapsing the entire system. The text glowed brightly on the massive screens for every single elite guest in the room to read clearly. Dedicated to Grandmother Eleanor. Thank you for believing in my vision when absolutely no one else did. Architect and sole founder, Alyssa Thorne. Connor stared up at the massive glowing screens. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out. The air had been completely knocked out of his lungs. He was caught red-handed. He was publicly, undeniably exposed as a thief, a liar, and a total fraud in front of his billionaire boss, his brilliant fiancée, and the most elite members of Aspen society. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Connor broke the paralyzing quiet with a frantic, wet gasp. He clawed at the collar of his custom tuxedo, suddenly looking as though the silk fabric was suffocating him. He pointed a trembling manicured finger at the massive projection screens illuminating the room, then whipped his head toward Reginald Pierce. "She hacked my network!" Connor shrieked, his voice cracking in a pathetic, high-pitched register that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "She is a malicious cybercriminal, Mr. Pierce. You have to understand what you are looking at. She breached my private servers. She manipulated the visual output of this room, and she embedded that fake watermark into my presentation files just now. This is a coordinated smear campaign. She is framing me to steal my credit." Connor was sweating so profusely that thick drops were rolling down his forehead and stinging his eyes. He frantically wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, smudging his expensive cologne into a desperate stench of fear. He looked wildly around the room, making eye contact with the elite Aspen guests, begging them with his wide, terrified eyes to believe his pathetic fabrication. Nia took another deliberate step away from him. Her expression had hardened into a mask of pure corporate litigation. As an attorney, she dealt with liars, frauds, and desperate men every single day. She recognized the frantic cadence of a cornered criminal. She looked at her father, waiting for his move. Reginald Pierce did not even blink at Connor's hysterical outburst. He simply raised two fingers in the air. Immediately, the lead security officer stepped forward from the shadows of the double doors. He was a massive, imposing man with a tactical earpiece and a heavy tablet secured in his grip. He moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of a former military operative. "Verify it, Vance," Reginald ordered, his voice an absolute glacier. Vance did not hesitate. His thick fingers flew across the tablet screen, interfacing directly with the Pierce Corp Enterprise servers via his secure satellite uplink. The entire dining room watched in absolute terrifying silence as the security chief ran real-time diagnostics on the code projected on the walls. Connor was visibly vibrating. He looked at my parents, silently pleading with them to intervene. My father Bradley took a hesitant step forward, clearing his throat loudly. "Now let us be reasonable here." Bradley started attempting to project his usual arrogant authority, though his voice trembled noticeably. "Mr. Pierce, Connor is your top executive. He has been loyal to you. Alyssa is simply a bitter dropout who fixes doorbells. She probably learned a few hacking tricks online to ruin her brother's big day. You cannot possibly take the word of a disgruntled sibling over the man who—" "Quiet," Reginald commanded. He did not raise his voice, but the sheer crushing weight of his authority slammed into my father like a physical blow. Bradley instantly snapped his mouth shut, shrinking back beside my mother, who was now quietly hyperventilating into a silk napkin. Vance looked up from his tactical tablet. He locked eyes with Reginald. "The digital signature is authentic," Sir Vance reported, his deep voice carrying flawlessly across the room. "I am looking at the original source architecture on our proprietary servers right now. The watermark is hard-coded into the foundational root files. It has been there since the exact second Connor submitted the protocol 2 years ago. Furthermore, the IP logs attached to the root creation do not match Connor's residential network or his corporate terminal." Vance turned his gaze toward me, giving a sharp, respectful nod. "The original creation logs route directly back to a classified military-grade server bank belonging to Aegis Spatial," Vance concluded. "The encryption keys match the proprietary biometric signature of Alyssa Thorne. There is absolutely no hack here, Mr. Pierce. Connor submitted stolen watermarked property and claimed it as his own." A collective gasp rippled through the VIP guests. The high society elites who had been whispering about my stained dress moments ago were now staring at Connor with open, undisguised disgust. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I watched Connor's entire universe completely implode. Nia finally spoke. Her voice was like cracking ice. You submitted stolen intellectual property to my father's company. Nia stated, her legal mind instantly assessing the catastrophic liability. You stood in my family's boardroom, accepted a massive executive promotion, and took millions of dollars in bonuses, all based on a system you stole from your own sister. Nia, baby, please, Connor begged, falling forward and reaching for her hands. It is not what it looks like. I modified it. I changed things. I made it better. Do not touch me, Nia commanded, stepping backward so sharply that Connor stumbled. You are a fraud. You are a thief. And you gave me a lab-grown synthetic ring while claiming it was a $200,000 family heirloom. You have lied to me since the absolute second we met. My mother Susan let out a sharp, devastated wail. Connor, tell them it is a mistake. Tell them you did the work. She looked at me, her face twisted in a mixture of profound shock and desperate anger. Alyssa, stop this right now. Turn off these screens. Tell Mr. Pierce this is just one of your childish pranks. You are ruining your brother's life. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I let her see the absolute unyielding steel in my eyes. I am not ruining anything, Mother, I replied, my voice ringing with lethal precision. Connor ruined his own life the moment he decided to steal from a woman he arrogantly assumed was too weak to fight back. He stole a highly unstable, obsolete beta version of my software. A version I had flagged for deletion because it contained fatal architectural vulnerabilities. Reginald Pierce stepped directly into Connor's personal space. The billionaire was radiating a fury so intense it felt like the air in the room was catching fire. Fatal vulnerabilities. Reginald repeated, his voice dropping an entire octave. Yes, I confirmed, turning to the billionaire. The routing protocol in that specific draft contains a backdoor logic flaw. If a hostile entity flooded the specific bandwidth with a targeted denial of service attack, the entire security grid would instantly collapse, leaving the physical premises entirely blind and the data servers completely exposed. It is a useless, broken system. Connor shook his head frantically, his face completely devoid of color. It works. The system works perfectly. We have had it running for 2 years and nothing has happened. Reginald grabbed Connor by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo. He hauled my brother upward, forcing Connor to stand on his tiptoes. You absolute monumental idiot! Reginald snarled, his composure finally shattering into pure raw rage. Do you have any idea what you have done? Sir, please, Connor whimpered, tears spilling down his cheeks, ruining his perfectly styled image. I just wanted to impress you. I wanted to be worthy of Nia. Reginald shoved Connor backward with massive force. Connor hit the dining table, sending crystal glasses and silver cutlery crashing to the floor in a deafening clatter. You did not just submit this stolen broken code as a school project, Connor, Reginald roared, his voice booming with terrifying authority. You did not just use it to secure a corner office and a fat paycheck. I took the security protocol you swore you built from scratch, and I leveraged it to secure the largest corporate contract in the history of Pierce Corp. The room went dead silent again. The kind of silence that feels heavy, suffocating, and absolute. My father Bradley suddenly looked like he was going to vomit. He grabbed the back of a chair to keep his balance. What contract? Daddy, Nia asked, her voice trembling slightly as the legal implications began to dawn on her. Reginald did not look at his daughter. He kept his furious gaze locked onto the pathetic, sniveling mess of a man bleeding out against the dining table. 6 months ago, based entirely on the flawless security test runs of what I thought was your proprietary system, Reginald explained, his voice vibrating with absolute menace. I sold this exact software architecture to the United States Department of Defense. My mother let out a sharp, horrified scream. She clamped both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute terror. My father collapsed into a chair, his legs completely giving out beneath him. I stood perfectly still, watching the glorious, devastating realization hit my brother. The federal government is currently utilizing that stolen, highly vulnerable beta code to secure 3 distinct naval intelligence data centers on the eastern seaboard. Reginald continued, stepping closer to Connor until he was looming over him like a judge delivering a death sentence. You sold stolen intellectual property to me, and I unknowingly sold it to the Pentagon. Connor began to hyperventilate violently. He clutched his chest, gasping for air as a full-blown panic attack seized his body. Corporate espionage, Reginald stated coldly, listing off the charges like a grim reaper. Grand larceny, wire fraud, and defrauding the federal government of the United States of America. You just placed national security assets at risk because you were too arrogant to write your own code and too stupid to realize you were stealing a broken prototype. Connor slid down the edge of the table. His expensive leather shoes slipped on the spilled wine, and he collapsed onto the hardwood floor. You are not just fired, Connor, Reginald said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. You are not just facing civil litigation that will bankrupt you and your entire arrogant family for the next 3 generations. You are looking at 20 years in a maximum security federal prison. Connor hit the floor hard. He dropped entirely to his knees, his hands planting into the puddle of red wine and shattered crystal. He looked up at the billionaire, his face a twisted, grotesque mask of absolute despair. He had lost his job. He had lost his wealthy fiancée. He had lost his fake reputation, and now he was going to lose his freedom. I looked down at the man who had tormented me for decades, the man who had called me a failure, who had stolen my work, and who had violently thrown wine in my face just moments ago. He was weeping openly, kneeling in the dirt, entirely broken. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, satisfying weight of justice. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, satisfying weight of justice. The unnatural stillness shattered. Susan let out a sound that was half shriek, half sob. She scrambled over the fallen wooden chairs, completely ignoring the shards of shattered crystal crunching beneath her expensive designer heels. Bradley followed close behind her, his face a mottled, terrifying shade of purple. They completely ignored the furious billionaire standing just feet away. Their golden boy was weeping on the floor, facing 2 decades in a federal penitentiary, and their only instinct was to turn their venom on the designated family scapegoat, me. Susan lunged forward and grabbed my forearm. Her sharp acrylic nails dug painfully into my skin. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I simply looked down at her manicured hand with absolute disgust, until she released her grip, her chest heaving as she struggled to formulate a defense for the indefensible. Alyssa, you have to stop this right now, Susan cried, her voice echoing shrilly across the cavernous room. You have so much money now, you own a $2 billion company. You do not need this. You do not need to ruin your brother for a few lines of computer code. I stared at the woman who had birthed me. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her entitlement was breathtaking. She was actually standing in the epicenter of a massive federal fraud investigation and demanding I sweep it under the rug because my bank account was sufficiently large. Bradley stepped up beside her, puffing out his chest in a pathetic, desperate attempt to reassert his patriarchal dominance. Listen to your mother, Alyssa. This has gone far enough. You made your point. You embarrassed him in front of his boss. Now fix it. Tell Mr. Pierce this was a joint project. Tell him you worked on the software together and Connor just took the lead on the presentation. We can smooth this over. I tilted my head, studying them like biological anomalies. A joint project. I spent 18 hours a day writing that architecture in our dark basement while you were paying off his massive credit card debts from his European ski trips. There was nothing joint about it. He is a thief. Susan waved her hands frantically, dismissing my trauma as if swatting away a fly. We only treated you harshly so you would toughen up. You were always so sensitive, so isolated and focused on your little computer projects. We had to prepare you for the real world. Look at you now. Our parenting worked. You are a billionaire. You should be thanking us, not sending your own brother to a federal prison. The collective gasp from the surrounding VIP guests was highly audible. Even the elite Aspen socialites, people accustomed to ruthless corporate maneuvering and cutthroat negotiations, were visibly sickened by the blatant emotional manipulation pouring from my mother's mouth. Nia, standing near her father, let out a harsh, bitter laugh. You abused her to toughen her up. You are actively trying to force her to confess to federal treason to save your fraudulent son. You people are genuinely repulsive. Susan ignored Nia completely. Her manic, desperate focus was locked entirely onto me. Hi is your brother, Alyssa. Blood is blood. Drop this nonsense right now. Fix the code for Mr. Pierce. Tell him, Connor helped you build it, and we can all walk away from this resort tonight as a family. A family. The word tasted like ash on my tongue. For 25 years I had craved a seat at their table. I had starved for their approval. I had twisted myself into knots trying to earn a fraction of the pride they showered on Connor. Now they were serving me the ultimate betrayal on a silver platter and demanding I call it loyalty. I smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was a freezing, calculated baring of teeth. You think Connor acted alone, I said softly, my voice carrying clearly through the room's high-tech acoustics. You stand here playing the desperate loving parents protecting their misguided son. But the truth is much darker than a simple stolen hard drive, isn't it, Bradley? My father froze. The aggressive flush instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening ashen shade of gray. I do not know what you are talking about, he stammered, taking a tiny subconscious step backward. When Connor stole my physical hard drives 3 years ago, I continued pacing slowly around the ruined dining table, my designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. I knew immediately. I went straight to the backup server I had manually installed in the basement utility closet. I needed those backup files to prove the intellectual property belonged to me. But when I logged in, the entire server had been wiped clean. A military-grade data scrub. Connor groaned from the floor, curling into a tight fetal position. He knew exactly what was coming. For years I wondered how Connor managed a complex, secure data wipe, I said, locking my gaze onto my terrified father. Connor does not know the difference between a basic firewall and a wireless router. He could not wipe a secure server if his life depended on it. But you could, Bradley. You spent 30 years in corporate IT management before retiring. Bradley began to sweat profusely, pulling at his expensive silk tie. You have absolutely no proof of anything. You are making wild, slanderous accusations to hurt this family. Proof is my specialty, I whispered. I raised my matte black titanium smartphone. I did not break eye contact with my father as my thumb tapped the screen. The 3 massive projections on the walls shifted instantly. The deep blue strings of the Aegis protocol vanished, replaced by the stark, blinding white background of a standard email client. The document was massive, blown up to 10 feet tall, so that every single person in the room could read the text perfectly. It was an archived email. The timestamp was dated exactly 3 years ago, the very morning after Connor had stolen my drives. The sender was Bradley Thorne. The recipient was Connor Thorne. I read the words aloud, my voice ringing like a gavel strike. I wiped Alyssa's backup drive so she cannot prove you took the code. The server is completely scrubbed. Submit the files to Pierce Corp today. Let her go flip burgers. We need this win, son. The silence in the room transformed from shocked to completely lethal. Susan slowly turned her head to look at her husband. Even she had not known the depths of his complicity. She thought Connor was just an opportunistic thief who had made a bad decision. She had absolutely no idea her husband was an active co-conspirator who had deliberately sabotaged my entire future to elevate his golden boy. Bradley, Susan whispered, her voice trembling with genuine, unfiltered horror. My father could not speak. His mouth opened and closed silently. He looked up at the massive screen, his own vicious words condemning him in giant black letters. I found that email buried in a deleted partition on your old home office router, I explained coldly. When you asked me to fix your home network last year because your streaming service was lagging, I installed a packet sniffer. It recovered years of your deleted data. I have been holding on to this specific email, waiting for the perfect moment to understand exactly how deep the rot in this family went. Reginald Pierce stepped forward. The billionaire moved with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a freight train. He stood shoulder to shoulder with his lead security officer, Vance. Vance, Reginald said, not taking his furious eyes off my father. Contact the federal authorities. Have them dispatch a tactical white-collar crime unit to this resort immediately. Ensure the FBI field office in Denver is alerted. Yes, sir, Vance replied, already speaking rapidly into his secure comms unit. Mr. Pierce, please. Bradley begged, his voice dropping into a pathetic, reedy whine as his arrogance entirely evaporated. It was just a family dispute. It was an internal matter regarding a college computer project. You cannot involve the federal government. It will ruin us. Reginald laughed. The sound contained zero humor. It was a sharp barking sound of pure concentrated contempt. A family dispute, Reginald repeated, tasting the words with absolute disgust. You actively aided and abetted the theft of highly classified software architecture. You conspired to defraud my global corporation. You facilitated the sale of compromised security protocols to the United States Department of Defense. You are not just a terrible father, Bradley. You are a domestic terrorist by proxy. Bradley's knees finally gave out. He collapsed heavily into the nearest dining chair, burying his face in his shaking hands. He was a man who had spent his entire life obsessing over country club status, golfing handicaps, and neighborhood prestige. Now he was facing federal indictment, asset seizure, and total public ruin. Susan was backing away from both her husband and her son. The reality of the situation was violently tearing down the pristine facade she had spent decades meticulously maintaining. She looked at me, her eyes wide, wild, and searching for any shred of the desperate, eager-to-please daughter she used to command. She found nothing. The Alyssa she knew had died the night they kicked me out of the house for demanding my stolen drives back. The woman standing before her was forged in titanium and secured by billion-dollar algorithms. You planned this, Susan gasped, pointing a shaking accusatory finger at me. You waited until the rehearsal dinner. You waited until we were surrounded by the most important people in Aspen. You set us up to be destroyed. I did not steal the code, Susan. I replied, my tone flat and entirely indifferent. I did not lie to a billionaire. I did not defraud the federal government. I simply brought a flashlight into the dark room where you have all been hiding for years. The destruction is entirely your own making. I turned my back on them. The gesture was final. It was the physical manifestation of severing the toxic cord that had bound me to their dysfunction for my entire life. I walked over to Reginald Pierce. The billionaire was watching me with a completely new expression. The fury directed at my family was still simmering in his eyes, but as he looked at me, there was a profound, undeniable respect. He recognized an apex predator when he saw one. Mr. Pierce, I said, maintaining perfect professional composure despite the chaos unfolding around us. My elite engineering team at Aegis Spatial has already developed a robust patch for the fatal vulnerabilities in the stolen beta code. We can deploy a secure over-the-air update to the naval intelligence data centers within the hour. We can quietly secure the federal grid before the Department of Defense even realizes they were compromised. Reginald's eyes widened slightly. You already have a patch ready? I have been tracking Connor's integration of the stolen code since the day he deployed it, I admitted smoothly. I could not act until I had absolute, undeniable proof of his fraud, and until he placed himself in a jurisdiction where I could corner him completely. But I would never allow national security to genuinely remain at risk due to my brother's incompetence. The patch is loaded on my secure servers and waiting for your authorization. Nia stepped up beside her father. She looked at me, her sharp, beautiful features softened by genuine admiration. She had just watched her perfect life blow up, her lavish wedding get cancelled, and her handsome fiancé get exposed as a federal criminal. Yet she looked at me not with anger, but with intense professional respect. You are terrifying, Alyssa Thorne, Nia said quietly. And I mean that as the highest possible compliment. Thank you, Nia, I replied. I am genuinely sorry about your wedding. You deserve significantly better than a fraud. Better to find out today than at the altar tomorrow, she said, pulling the massive synthetic engagement ring off her finger. She tossed it onto the table where it landed next to a shattered wine glass, the fake diamond catching the low light. My father's legal team is going to annihilate them criminally, but I want to personally draft the civil suit for damages. I am going to take everything they own. Reginald nodded slowly, a grim, highly satisfied smile finally touching his lips. Do it. Bankrupt whatever is left of them. He turned his attention back to me, extending his large hand. Miss Thorne, we need to secure that federal grid immediately. And once that is handled, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about a permanent, highly lucrative partnership between Pierce Corp and Aegis Spatial. I look forward to it, Mr. Pierce, I said, shaking his hand firmly. The distant wail of police sirens began to echo up the winding mountain road, cutting sharply through the quiet Aspen night. The federal tactical units were arriving. The elite resort security had already locked down all exterior doors and blocked the elevators. There was no escape. Connor was still on the floor weeping loudly into his hands, mourning the end of his stolen life. Bradley sat paralyzed in his chair, staring blankly at the projected email that had sealed his fate. Susan stood isolated in the corner, clutching her pearls, realizing she had lost her golden boy, her wealthy lifestyle and her social standing all in the span of 10 minutes. I did not look back at them as I followed Reginald and Nia Pierce out of the dining room. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a place at their miserable table. Tonight I had bought the entire building and permanently evicted them from the premises. I stopped right at the threshold of the heavy oak double doors. Reginald Pierce was already stepping into the brightly lit hallway, but Nia froze beside me. Her hand was resting on the brass door handle, but her knuckles were completely white. She took a slow, deliberate breath that expanded her chest. The brilliant corporate attorney who had spent her entire career dismantling fraudulent executives in federal courtrooms was not quite finished with her work. Nia turned her back to the hallway and faced the ruined dining room. She did not scream. She did not display a single ounce of the hysterical panic that was currently consuming my mother. Nia dealt exclusively in facts. She thrived on paper trails and undeniable ledgers. She walked back toward the massive mahogany dining table with the predatory grace of a shark circling bleeding prey. "Get up, Connor," Nia commanded. Her voice was flat and devoid of any human warmth. Connor was still curled on the floor, clutching his stomach as if he had been physically disemboweled. He peered up at Nia through bloodshot, tear-soaked eyes. He let out a pathetic whimpering sound, reaching one trembling hand toward the hem of her designer dress. "Nia, baby, please," Connor choked out. "I am so sorry. I was just trying to be the man you wanted. I wanted to give you the world." I panicked. "Do not ever call me baby again," Nia stated, her tone dropping the temperature in the room by another 10 degrees. "Stand up and face me. We are going to have a brief, highly documented legal discussion regarding the wedding finances." Connor scrambled to his feet, slipping slightly in the puddle of spilled wine. He wiped his face, leaving streaks of dirt and sweat across his pale cheeks. My parents, Bradley and Susan, instantly stopped their frantic whispering. They turned their horrified attention back to Nia. They were desperately hoping that Nia was about to offer their son some sort of legal clemency or a way out of the impending federal indictment. They were entirely wrong. Nia reached into her structured leather tote bag and withdrew a sleek silver iPad. She did not even look at Connor as she tapped the screen. She turned her gaze to me. "Alyssa," Nia said, her voice projecting clearly across the room. "You currently have absolute control over the audiovisual architecture of this room. I need to cast my display to the main screens." I gave her a single sharp nod. I tapped the face of my matte black titanium smartphone, authorizing her device to bypass the resort's encrypted firewall. "You have full access, Nia. The floor is yours." The massive projection screens surrounding the dining table flickered instantly. The damning email from my father vanished. In its place, a highly detailed banking spreadsheet appeared, glowing brightly in the dim light. It was an official financial ledger belonging to Pierce Corp. Nia stepped directly in front of Connor. "Let us talk about the Aspen wedding budget, Connor. 6 weeks ago, my father transferred exactly $500,000 from a Pierce Corp subsidiary account directly into your personal management trust. You explicitly requested to handle the vendor payouts yourself. You claimed you wanted to surprise me with luxury upgrades and handle the stressful logistics so I could focus on my legal casework." Connor swallowed so hard, his Adam's apple bobbed violently. Yes, I did that for you, Nia. I wanted everything to be perfect." Nia swiped her finger across the iPad screen. A new document appeared on the wall displays. It was a digital invoice from the Aspen Resort. "That is fascinating, Connor," Nia said, her voice sharp and metallic. "Because I had a very interesting conversation with the resort's director of hospitality about an hour before this dinner began. He pulled me aside to discreetly inform me that the primary vendor escrow account is completely empty. The catering staff has not been paid. The luxury suite accommodations for our VIP guests have not been secured. The floral arrangements, the private jets, the event staff, none of it has been funded." Susan let out a sharp gasp. She rushed forward, grabbing her son's arm. Connor, what is she talking about? The wedding planner told me everything was handled. Where is Mr. Pierce's money? Connor jerked his arm away from his mother. His eyes were darting frantically around the room, searching for an exit that did not exist. It is a bank error! Connor shouted, his voice cracking with desperate panic. The wire transfers are just delayed. They are caught in a holding account because of the large sum. It is a standard international banking delay. Nia, you know how these corporate transfers work. The money is in transit. Nia tilted her head, studying him with an expression of pure clinical disgust. You are an incredibly poor liar, Connor. You always have been. The problem is that you are also incredibly arrogant. You genuinely believed I would never audit my own wedding finances. Nia tapped her screen again. A new window popped up on the massive projections. It displayed a routing number, a complex string of alphanumeric characters, and a highly encrypted firewall barricade. I hired a private forensic accountant 3 days ago when the floral vendor called me threatening to cancel, Nia explained smoothly. My accountant traced the $500,000. It never went to the resort. It never went to a holding account. It went directly into a heavily encrypted offshore shell account based in the Cayman Islands. But the firewall on the account is military grade. My accountant could not breach the final encryption layer to see the transactional history. Connor visibly slumped. A wave of profound relief washed over his sweaty face. He actually believed he was safe because the account was locked. He let out a breathless, arrogant little chuckle. You see, you have no proof, Nia. You are just being paranoid. You cannot see the ledger because it is a secure vendor trust. I am protecting our assets. Nia did not respond to him. She simply turned her head and looked directly at me. The elite corporate lawyer and the billionaire tech founder shared a silent mutual understanding. We were about to bury him completely. Alyssa, Nia said, her voice echoing through the silent room. Since you are the actual tech genius in this family, can you decrypt this offshore account? Connor has been trying to hide from me. Connor spun around, his eyes wide with sudden absolute terror. Wait! Connor screamed, lunging forward. No, you cannot do that. That is a federal privacy violation. You do not have a warrant. Vance, the massive security chief, stepped effortlessly into Connor's path, blocking him with a chest as solid as an anvil. Do not move another inch, son. Vance rumbled, resting his hand heavily on his tactical belt. I did not even look at Connor. I simply lifted my custom smartphone. I mirrored the offshore routing number from Nia's display directly into my terminal. Connor thought he was incredibly clever using a Cayman Islands shell account, but he was using standard commercial encryption protocols. To an architect who builds subterranean data fortresses for the Department of Defense, a commercial firewall is nothing more than a wet paper bag. I ran a proprietary brute force decryption algorithm that I had personally coded for Aegis Spatial. I do not need a warrant, Connor, I said, my fingers flying across the black glass of my screen. Because I am not law enforcement. I am simply a private citizen, performing a highly aggressive digital audit on an open wireless network. I pressed the final execution command. The massive projection screens above us shattered into a cascade of green and white pixels as the offshore firewall completely collapsed. The encryption melted away in less than 4 seconds. The true destination of Reginald Pierce's $500,000 was laid entirely bare for the room to see. My father Bradley let out a strangled, horrified noise that sounded like a dying animal. The screens displayed the offshore ledger. The current available balance was $0.00. Below the empty balance was a transactional history containing hundreds of rapid-fire wire transfers. The money had not gone to florists or caterers. It had been funneled directly into offshore sports betting syndicates and high-stakes crypto gambling platforms. There were transfers of $10,000, $20,000, and $50,000, all executed within the last 45 days. Connor had aggressively bet on international soccer matches, obscure algorithmic coin drops, and illegal online poker rooms. I had lost every single cent. He gambled it away. Nia stated, her voice ringing with the finality of a gavel striking a judge's block. You took my father's money, the money meant to celebrate our marriage, and you fed it into a degenerate gambling addiction. Susan physically collapsed. Her knees buckled, and she hit the floor beside the ruined dining table. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically. Her golden boy, the son she had elevated above me, her entire life, the son she had praised and coddled and protected, was a completely irredeemable degenerate. He was a thief, a liar, a corporate spy, and a gambling addict. Bradley stared at the screens, his mouth hanging open. $500,000, Bradley whispered, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated shock. Connor, how could you? We paid off your credit cards. We cleared your debts. You promised me you stopped betting. Connor was hyperventilating so hard he was turning blue. He clawed at his own hair, ripping his perfect styling into a frantic mess. It was a sure thing, Connor shrieked, addressing the ceiling rather than the people in the room. I had a system. I was going to double the venue money. I was going to pay the resort and keep the profit. The market just turned on me. It was bad luck. I just needed a little more time to win it back. Reginald Pierce stepped out of the shadows. The billionaire had been silent, observing the total dismantling of Connor Thorne with cold, calculating eyes. Now he moved forward, radiating absolute power. You stole from my corporation to impress me, Reginald stated, his voice low and deadly. You endangered federal security to secure a promotion. And then you stole directly from my personal accounts to feed an offshore gambling habit. Reginald looked at Vance, giving a single sharp nod. Add grand theft and wire fraud to the federal indictment, Vance. Ensure the FBI brings a forensic accounting team. I want every single digital footprint this pathetic excuse for a man has ever left entirely eradicated. Yes, sir, Vance confirmed, pulling a set of heavy steel zip ties from his tactical vest. Connor let out a raw, guttural scream. He scrambled backward across the hardwood floor, desperately trying to escape the security chief. He hit the wall, sliding into the corner like a trapped rat. Mom, Dad, do something, Connor wailed, reaching his hands out toward his parents. Call a lawyer. Give him the money back. Sell your house. Just pay him back. Susan and Bradley did not move. They sat frozen in the wreckage of their own making. They could not sell their house to save him. The civil suits Nia was about to file would freeze every asset they possessed by morning. They were completely and utterly powerless. They had spent decades enabling a monster, and now the monster was finally being caged. Nia looked down at Connor, her face completely devoid of emotion. She slung her designer tote bag over her shoulder. Enjoy federal prison, Connor. I hear they do not have very good Wi-Fi for your sports betting. Nia turned on her heel and walked elegantly toward the heavy oak doors without looking back a single time. Reginald Pierce offered me a respectful nod, adjusting his tailored suit jacket before following his daughter out into the hallway. I stood alone in the center of the room, looking down at the people who had made my life a living hell. Connor was sobbing hysterically as Vance hauled him to his feet, securing his wrists with the heavy zip ties. Susan was weeping into the carpet. Bradley was staring blankly at the wall, his entire existence shattered. I tapped my smartphone, wiping the massive projection screens completely black. I slipped the phone back into my designer clutch, snapping it shut with a sharp metallic click. I did not say goodbye. They did not deserve another word from me. I turned and walked out the doors, leaving them to the federal authorities and the cold, bitter reality of their own total destruction. I paused with my hand resting on the heavy brass handle of the dining room door. My designer heel had just stepped on something thick and crumpled lying near the threshold. I looked down. It was the legal waiver. The same wine-stained document Connor had aggressively shoved at my chest earlier this evening, demanding my immediate signature. I slowly bent down and picked up the heavy cardstock. Earlier tonight, Connor had vehemently claimed this was simply a standard forfeiture agreement. He told everyone it was merely a legal formality to sign away my 10% of our grandfather's inheritance so he could cover the exorbitant cost of this rehearsal dinner. But knowing what I knew now, knowing that he had completely drained the wedding funds and funneled $500,000 into offshore betting syndicates, the existence of this document suddenly made absolutely zero sense. Why would a man who had already stolen $500,000 care about a relatively tiny inheritance fraction? I turned my back to the hallway and faced the ruined room once more. Vance was just finishing securing the thick plastic zip ties around Connor's wrists, while Reginald and Nia Pierce watched with cold satisfaction. "Wait," I called out. My voice sliced through the heavy air, instantly commanding the attention of every single person left in the room. "I think the federal investigators are going to want to take a very close look at this document." I unfolded the crumpled paper, smoothing out the creases. I bypassed the standard inheritance forfeiture jargon on the front page and flipped directly to the dense microscopic legal print buried at the very bottom of the second page. My eyes quickly scanned the complex financial terminology. My blood ran ice cold. Connor was not just a thief, he was a complete sociopath. I looked up, locking my gaze onto my brother, who was now kneeling on the floor in a puddle of spilled wine. "This is not an inheritance waiver," I announced, holding the document up high. "This is an irrevocable guarantor agreement." Nia Pierce instantly snapped her head toward me, her sharp legal instincts fully activated. "Read the indemnification clause, Alyssa. Read it out loud." I focused on the fine print, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "By signing this document, the undersigning party agrees to assume full primary financial liability and absolute guarantor status for the outstanding principal and all accruing interest of the offshore debt portfolio listed in Addendum B." I flipped to the back page. Addendum B listed a Cayman Islands holding company, the exact same offshore shell company I had just exposed on the massive projection screens. "The outstanding principal debt is listed right here," I stated, looking directly at my parents. $3 million. The entire room inhaled a collective horrified breath. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hung in the air like a physical weight. Connor did not just embezzle the wedding funds. I explained, my tone completely flat. He lost the initial $500,000, and then he kept gambling. He leveraged his fake executive position at Pierce Corp to take out a massive line of illegal offshore credit to chase his losses. He racked up $3 million in high-interest syndicate debt. I threw the crumpled document onto the ruined dining table. I knew the debt collectors were coming for him. I continued staring at my pathetic brother. He knew he was completely bankrupt, so he drafted this fraudulent waiver. He brought it to his own rehearsal dinner, intending to bully and publicly humiliate me into signing it without reading the fine print. He wanted to legally anchor his entire catastrophic $3 million gambling debt directly to my $2 billion company. He was going to use me as his personal human shield. Susan stumbled backward, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. She looked at her golden boy, the son she had sacrificed my entire childhood to protect, with pure, unadulterated revulsion. Bradley's face contorted in absolute horror. The blood drained completely from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a corpse. He pushed himself up from his chair, his hands shaking violently as he looked down at his zip-tied son. "You told us that paper was just to get her to pay for the rehearsal dinner," Bradley yelled, his voice cracking with pure disbelief. Connor thrashed wildly against Vance's iron grip on the floor, fighting against the plastic restraints digging into his wrists. He looked up at his father, his face a grotesque mask of selfishness and panic. "I had to save myself," Connor screamed back. "She is useless anyway. I had to save myself. She is useless anyway." Connor's pathetic screech echoed off the crystal chandeliers hanging in the dead air like toxic smoke. He was kneeling in a puddle of expensive wine, his wrists bound by thick plastic zip ties, his perfectly tailored tuxedo ruined, yet he still possessed the sheer blind arrogance to insult me. I looked down at the sniveling, broken man who had tormented me since childhood. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "Useless," I repeated, letting the syllables roll off my tongue with freezing precision. "I am the owner of a $2 billion enterprise, Connor. You are currently begging on your knees, facing decades in federal prison, entirely reliant on a fraudulent document that just exposed you as a $3 million liability. I think we have permanently redefined the word useless tonight." Susan let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She looked at her son, truly seeing him for the first time. The golden boy illusion had evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, cowardly thief who had eagerly tried to bankrupt his own sister to cover his illicit tracks. Before Susan could utter a single word of defense, the heavy oak doors of the dining room violently swung open. The heavy thud of the doors striking the walls made everyone flinch. 3 uniformed Aspen police officers marched into the room, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They were flanked by a tall, sharply dressed man with silver hair and a deeply furious expression. It was Mr. Sterling, the resort's elite general manager. "Nobody moves a single inch," Sterling commanded, his voice slicing through the remaining tension. Reginald Pierce stepped slightly to the side, allowing the authorities a clear path to my disgraced family. Nia simply crossed her arms, a look of profound satisfaction settling across her features. She recognized exactly what was happening. Sterling marched directly toward the ruined dining table, ignoring the shattered crystal and spilled wine. He stopped mere feet from my father, holding a thick leather clipboard. "Bradley Thorne." Sterling barked, his eyes flashing with utter contempt. "Exactly 1 hour ago, the $500,000 certified check you and your son provided to cover the remaining balance of this wedding weekend bounced. The issuing bank flagged it for insufficient funds and suspected wire fraud." Bradley opened his mouth, his face turning an alarming shade of gray, but no sound came out. "You are occupying a premium venue, consuming luxury resources, and attempting to host a high society event with absolutely zero capital." Sterling continued, his voice echoing for every remaining VIP guest to hear. "That constitutes felony theft of services in the state of Colorado. I am ordering you, your son, and your entire party to evacuate my premises immediately, or these officers will place you all under arrest for criminal fraud." Susan let out a piercing shriek, clutching her chest as she stumbled back into the wall. The elite guests, the socialites she had spent months trying to impress, were now watching her public humiliation with undisguised disgust. The facade was completely obliterated. Bradley leaped out of his chair. Panic completely consumed him. He was a man obsessed with his country club reputation, and the threat of being perp-walked out of Aspen's premier resort in handcuffs was destroying his sanity. "Wait!" Bradley yelled, his voice cracking hysterically. He lunged toward his leather briefcase resting on a nearby side table. His hands shook violently as he fumbled with the brass latches. "You cannot throw us out. You cannot arrest us. We have a secondary arrangement." Sterling narrowed his eyes, motioning for the police officers to hold their position. "What arrangement? You are completely bankrupt." Bradley yanked a thick red folder from his briefcase and practically threw it onto the table. He pointed a trembling finger at the paperwork. "Connor gave you a deed when the wire transfer was delayed yesterday. Connor signed over the deed to our family home as collateral." Connor flinched on the floor, squeezing his eyes shut as his father broadcasted yet another layer of his desperate, chaotic maneuvering. Bradley turned to the police officers, sweating profusely. "It is a $3 million property in a gated community. It covers the wedding expenses entirely. We are legally protected. You cannot evict us when we have provided secure real estate collateral." I watched my father desperately cling to his final shred of dignity. He had blindly sacrificed the family estate, the physical manifestation of his precious status, just to maintain the illusion of wealth for one more night. Sterling picked up the red folder with a look of profound distaste. He opened the cover and scanned the legal document inside. His furious expression slowly shifted into one of deep, sudden confusion. He adjusted his glasses, tracing his finger along the bottom of the contract. "Mr. Thorne," Sterling said, his tone shifting from angry to entirely bewildered, "the resort did not accept this collateral." Bradley froze, his hand still hovering in the air. "What are you talking about?" Connor said. "He signed it over to the resort." "He did not," Sterling corrected, tapping the thick parchment. "Our venue does not accept residential real estate in lieu of liquid capital. However, your son was highly desperate to keep the event moving forward yesterday. He utilized an expedited third-party broker to secure the debt. This deed was transferred to and accepted by our parent holding company." Bradley let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He wiped his sweaty forehead, a pathetic smile of triumph forming on his lips. "Then we are fine. The holding company owns the debt. We have a valid contract. Tell your officers to back off." Sterling did not move. He looked down at the signature line on the broker agreement, and a slow, almost predatory smirk crept across his face. "Sir, the collateral was accepted by the parent holding company." Sterling repeated, his voice dropping into a deadly, precise cadence. "But I do not think you understand who you are dealing with." Sterling closed the red folder with a sharp snap. He turned his body, stepping aside, and gestured directly toward me with an open palm. "Allow me to introduce the owner of the holding company," Sterling announced, bowing his head slightly in my direction. The room stopped breathing. Bradley slowly turned his head. His eyes locked onto mine, widening until they practically bulged out of his skull. Susan let out a soft, whimpering choke, sliding slowly down the wall until she hit the floor. Connor simply stopped crying, staring at me with a blank, hollow look of total, inescapable doom. I stepped forward, my designer heels clicking against the silent floor. I reached out and plucked the red folder from Sterling's hands. I opened it, glancing at the deed to the massive, pretentious house where I had spent 25 years being treated like a ghost. I looked up at Bradley, letting him see the absolute freezing void in my eyes. "It seems you are trespassing on my property, Bradley," I stated, my voice echoing like shattering glass. "And I want you evicted." Bradley's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at the red folder in my hand, then up at my face, his mind violently rejecting the reality of the situation. He let out a breathless, wheezing sound, stumbling backward until his calves hit the edge of his overturned dining chair. "That is impossible," Bradley choked out, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You do not own a holding company." "Connor went through a private broker, a highly discreet elite broker in Denver. We vetted the firm." "You vetted a landing page Connor found on a desperation search at 2 in the morning." I corrected, my tone completely merciless. "When you are a billionaire, Bradley, you do not just put your money in a standard checking account. You diversify. You create subsidiary branches. Aegis Spatial is my primary enterprise, but I also own a network of private equity firms and holding companies designed to acquire high-risk debt." I paced slowly in front of him, letting the click of my heels serve as a metronome, counting down the final seconds of his elite lifestyle. When Connor realized he had gambled away the wedding funds and Mr. Pierce was going to demand receipts, he panicked, I explained, making sure every remaining guest in the room could hear the pathetic details. He went online looking for a hard money lender who could front him $500,000 in less than 24 hours. My algorithms flagged his search inquiries the second he accessed the network using his terminal. I simply had my financial team route his application directly to one of my subsidiaries. Bradley's knees gave out completely. He fell back into his chair, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. "You literally handed the deed of your multi-million-dollar suburban estate over to a shell company owned by the daughter. You have spent 25 years abusing," I stated, letting the absolute weight of their colossal stupidity crush them. "I bought his debt. I own the collateral. And since Connor defaulted on the venue payment the moment that certified check bounced an hour ago, the forfeiture clause is officially active." Connor let out a hollow, agonizing groan from his spot on the floor, fully realizing that his desperate attempt to save himself had directly resulted in his parents losing their home. "I am officially foreclosing on your house," I announced, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. "The property is now a corporate asset of Aegis Spatial. You have until exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning to pack your bags and vacate the premises." The realization hit Bradley and Susan like a physical freight train. Susan let out a sound that defied human description. It was a guttural, tearing wail of absolute despair. Her entire world, her country club memberships, her sprawling, manicured lawns, her pristine neighborhood reputation had just been vaporized in an instant. She collapsed completely onto the hardwood floor, her designer gown soaking up the spilled wine. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees. It was a pathetic, grotesque display. She reached out with shaking, manicured hands and grabbed the hem of my wine-stained silk dress. "Alyssa, please." Susan sobbed, tears ruining her expensive makeup, leaving dark, jagged streaks down her cheeks. "You cannot do this. We are your parents. You cannot do this to your own mother." I looked down at the woman gripping my ruined dress. I felt absolutely nothing, no guilt, no hesitation, just the satisfying closure of a wound that had been bleeding for over 2 decades. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the itemized invoice the venue manager had handed me earlier in the evening. I dropped the slip of paper directly onto the floor, letting it land right in front of her weeping face. That is the $15,000 receipt for the rehearsal dinner catering, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly freezing whisper. I believe you told me earlier tonight, pay up or try Uber. Susan stared at the receipt fluttering onto her lap, her brain completely short-circuiting. The cruel, flippant remark she had weaponized against me just an hour ago had become the exact instrument of her financial execution. She opened her mouth to scream, but only a dry, rattling wheeze escaped. Bradley remained slumped in his chair, completely catatonic, staring at the floor as his entire reality dissolved into nothingness. They were no longer the elite Aspen socialites they had spent decades pretending to be. They were just trespassers with a massive bill they could not afford. Seeing his parents entirely neutralized, Connor's survival instincts kicked into overdrive. His supposed safety net had evaporated. His $3 million shield had been ripped away. The only remaining asset in the room was the billionaire family he had spent 2 years manipulating. Connor scrambled on his hands and knees. He literally crawled across the hardwood floor, dragging his $1,000 tuxedo trousers through the sticky puddles of spilled wine and crushed glass. He looked like a cornered, pathetic animal dragging itself toward a lifeline. He stopped right at the tips of Nia Pierce's designer heels, reaching out with shaking, blood-stained fingers, terrified to actually touch her. "Nia, please," Connor begged, his voice a grotesque, high-pitched sob that echoed through the stunned dining room. "You have to listen to me. I was sick. I am sick. The gambling, it is a disease. I did not mean to hurt you or your father. I can change. I will go to rehab tomorrow. I swear on my life I will get clean." I was weeping so heavily that saliva and tears were dripping onto her shoes. Nia did not take a single step backward. She stood absolutely still, looking down at the man she had planned to marry with an expression of pure, unadulterated clinical detachment. "Just give me one more chance," Connor pleaded, clasping his hands together in prayer. "I will pay your father back every single cent. I will work for Pierce Corp for free. I will scrub floors. I will do anything. We love each other, Nia. We were going to build a life together. You cannot just throw me away over a mistake." Nia looked at him the way a scientist observes a parasitic infection under a microscope. As an elite corporate litigator, she had deposed ruthless CEOs, dismantled corrupt hedge fund managers, and stared down criminal syndicates. She did not do hysteria. She did not do emotional outbursts. She dealt strictly in absolute, undeniable facts. "You are offering to pay my father back," Nia stated, her voice slicing through his manic sobbing with lethal, freezing grace. "You stole $500,000. You owe an offshore gambling syndicate another $3 million. You do not possess a single marketable skill, and the security software you claim to invent was entirely stolen from the sister you spent your life abusing. It would take you 10 lifetimes of scrubbing floors to pay off the interest on your debt alone." Connor flinched as if she had struck him across the face with a lead pipe. He looked up, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and desperate. "But I love you," he choked out, playing his final pathetic card. Nia reached up with her right hand. Her fingers gripped the massive, glittering engagement ring on her left hand. The ring, Connor had sworn, was a $200,000 antique family heirloom, which my decryption had already proven was a synthetic, lab-grown stone he bought online for $3,000. She slid the heavy ring off her finger in one smooth, deliberate motion. "You do not love me, Connor," Nia said, her tone completely devoid of pity. "You loved my proximity to power. You loved my father's bank accounts. You loved the shield my family name provided you. But you fundamentally misunderstood who we are." She held the synthetic diamond between her thumb and forefinger, letting it catch the ambient light of the crystal chandeliers above them. "My family built an empire from the ground up through blood and sweat," Nia declared, her voice ringing with the undeniable weight of her legacy. "We survived corporate warfare, market crashes, and ruthless competitors. We value loyalty, brilliance, and absolute integrity. We do not breed with thieves." Connor let out a devastating wail, recognizing the absolute finality of her words. Nia turned her wrist. She held the ring directly over a half-full crystal glass of champagne resting on the edge of the dining table. She opened her fingers. The fake diamond dropped with a sharp, heavy plink, sinking straight to the bottom of the bubbling golden liquid. "The wedding is officially off," Nia stated, adjusting the strap of her tote bag with perfect composure. She turned her head toward her father, who was watching the scene with deep, resonant pride. Dad, call the feds. Have the tactical unit move in. I want him out of my sight. Reginald Pierce gave a single curt nod to Vance. The massive security chief did not hesitate. He reached down and hoisted Connor off the floor by the lapels of his soaked tuxedo jacket, treating him with no more respect than a bag of garbage. Vance shoved Connor forward directly into the waiting hands of the 3 Aspen police officers who had been standing by the doorway with the resort manager. The lead officer spun Connor around with practiced efficiency. He pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clicks reverberated through the silent dining room as they snapped shut over Connor's wrists, replacing the temporary plastic zip ties. "Connor Thorne, you are under arrest," the officer stated, his voice a flat, booming baritone. "You are being charged with grand larceny, corporate espionage, wire fraud, and interstate financial crimes. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The reality of the cold steel biting into his wrists finally broke whatever fragile delusion Connor was still clinging to. The charming executive facade completely vanished. He began to thrash violently against the officers, kicking his feet and twisting his shoulders like a spoiled toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "Get your hands off me!" Connor shrieked, saliva flying from his lips as he struggled helplessly. "You cannot do this. I am a Thorne. I am a Pierce executive. You are an unemployed felon," Reginald corrected coldly, stepping squarely in front of his daughter to shield her from the pathetic display. "Get him out of here." The officers yanked Connor forward, forcing him to walk. As they dragged him past his parents, Connor twisted his neck, his eyes wide and bloodshot, filled with venomous blame. "This is your fault," Connor screamed at Bradley and Susan, his voice cracking into a high pitch. "You never gave me enough. You cut me off when I needed cash. If you had just given me my inheritance early, I would not have had to borrow from the syndicate. You ruined me." Susan covered her mouth, unleashing a muffled, horrified sob. The golden child she had worshipped her entire life was now publicly blaming her for his own criminal greed. Then Connor locked eyes with me, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unrestrained hatred. He dug his heels into the carpet, forcing the officers to drag his dead weight. "I hope you burn, Alyssa," he roared, spit flying down his chin. "You were supposed to be the failure. You were supposed to be nothing. You ruined my life. I hate you." He sounded utterly pathetic. The handsome, untouchable golden boy had been reduced to a crying, snot-nosed, handcuffed mess, throwing a tantrum in front of Aspen's most elite socialites. I did not blink. I simply watched him kill, letting the absolute silence of the room highlight his miserable downfall. "Move it," the lead officer ordered, jerking Connor forward by the arm. Seeing his only son being hauled away like a common street criminal finally broke Bradley. His country club reputation was dissolving before his very eyes. The illusion of his perfect family was dead, and sheer blind panic took over his rational mind. "Stop," Bradley bellowed. He lunged forward, ignoring the explicit warnings from the police. He grabbed the shoulder of the lead officer, attempting to pull him away from Connor. "Unhand my boy right now. I am Bradley Thorne. I will have your badges. I will call the governor." The reaction was instantaneous and brutal. The second officer stepped in, grabbed Bradley by the wrist, and spun him around with terrifying speed. Bradley let out a startled yelp as the officer slammed him face first onto the ruined dining table, right into the puddle of spilled champagne and shattered crystal. "Do not ever touch a police officer!" the cop growled, pinning Bradley's arm sharply behind his back. Bradley groaned in pain, his cheek pressed flat against the wet wood. "You are under arrest for assaulting a peace officer and obstruction of justice. Put your hands behind your back." The collective gasp from the remaining VIP guests sucked all the air out of the room. The local senators, the hedge fund managers, the elite socialites Susan had spent months courting, they all watched in utter revulsion. The pristine, untouchable Thorne family image was entirely shattered. Bradley was being handcuffed on a wet table. Connor was being dragged out the door screaming like a lunatic. Susan was sobbing on the floor in a ruined dress, completely bankrupt and about to be homeless. I stood quietly in the center of the wreckage, my posture perfect, my expression serene. The checkmate was complete. The heavy oak doors remained propped open as the police officers hauled a dripping handcuffed Bradley to his feet. They dragged him roughly toward the main exit of the dining room, forcing Susan to stumble along behind them. The officers paused in the drafty threshold to coordinate their transport vehicles over their radios. The biting Colorado mountain air swept into the room, cutting through the residual heat of the chaotic evening. Bradley stood detained near the exit, shivering violently. The expensive champagne he had been slammed into was rapidly freezing against his skin and ruining his bespoke suit. Susan huddled next to him, her arms wrapped tightly around her own torso. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. She was shivering from the cold, but mostly from the devastating, paralyzing shock of losing her entire reality in the span of 30 minutes. With the trash officially taken out, the room fell dead silent. The remaining Aspen elite, the hedge fund managers, the senators, and the corporate executives stood paralyzed. Nobody reached for their phones. Nobody dared to whisper. They had just witnessed a masterclass in absolute destruction. The pristine, untouchable Thorne family image had been butchered, filleted, and tossed to the wolves right in front of their eyes. Reginald Pierce broke the heavy quiet. He did not look angry. He did not look disturbed. He looked profoundly impressed. He adjusted his tailored jacket, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his lapel, restoring his immaculate composure. The ruthless billionaire, a man who famously bowed to absolutely no one in the corporate world, turned his piercing gaze away from my disgraced parents at the door. He looked directly at me. He bypassed the shattered crystal and the ruined centerpieces, walking with steady, commanding authority toward the head of the room. He bypassed the seats designated for his executives. He approached the master chair at the very center of the VIP table, the seat of honor. With deliberate, respectful precision, Reginald reached out and pulled the heavy velvet chair out from the table. "Ms. Thorne." Reginald stated, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the vaulted room, completely ignoring the ruined family bleeding out by the door. "I believe we have a highly classified Department of Defense contract that requires a competent project director. Please take a seat." A fresh wave of shock rippled through the gathered socialites. Nia stood gracefully beside her father, her posture radiating absolute agreement and respect. Vance folded his massive arms, offering a rare, subtle nod of approval. They were not looking at me as an inheritance victim or a scorned sister. They were looking at an equal. A corporate predator who had just protected their empire from a $3 million liability. I smoothed the front of my silk dress and walked toward the VIP table. The crowd of elites parted for me, instantly stepping back to clear my path, their eyes wide with newfound reverence. I was no longer the quiet, overlooked middle child. I was the architect of Aegis Spatial. I was the woman holding the deed to the Thorne estate. As I reached the head of the table, I turned around before taking my seat. I looked straight across the grand dining room, past the glittering chandeliers and the awestruck guests. My eyes locked onto the drafty exit. Susan and Bradley stood shivering in the doorway, under the harsh grip of the local police. Their faces were drained of all color, contorted in absolute soul-crushing horror. They could do nothing but watch as the daughter they had cast out, abused, and publicly labeled a worthless failure was treated like royalty by the billionaire they had worshipped and begged to impress. Nia Pierce did not even spare a backward glance at the pathetic scene unfolding near the exit. She simply raised two perfectly manicured fingers in the air. The Aspen Resort's elite catering staff materialized instantly from the shadows. Dressed in immaculate white jackets, they moved with military precision, sweeping away the shattered crystal, mopping up the spilled champagne, and replacing the ruined tablecloth in a matter of seconds. A sommelier stepped forward, uncorking a fresh, chilled bottle of vintage Dom Perignon. The crisp pop of the cork echoed loudly, breaking the final remnants of tension in the room. He poured the bubbling golden liquid into 3 pristine flutes placed in front of Reginald, Nia, and me. Nia took her seat directly to my right. She picked up her glass, her eyes catching the light of the chandeliers above us. She looked at me not as a prospective employee, but as a formidable ally. To dodging bullets and brilliant women, Nia declared, her voice ringing with absolute, unapologetic triumph. I picked up my flute, the cool crystal grounding me in the reality of my absolute victory. I clinked my glass against Nia's, then reached across to tap Reginald's glass. The clear chime of the toast felt like a death knell for the Thorne family legacy. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The champagne tasted like pure vindication. Without missing a beat, the three of us seamlessly pivoted into a high-level corporate discussion as if the preceding 30 minutes of criminal arrests and family betrayal had simply been a brief intermission. Reginald leaned forward, interlacing his fingers on the table, immediately diving into the logistics of the Department of Defense contract. We discussed the aggressive acquisition of smaller cybersecurity startups to bolster Aegis Spatial's infrastructure. We analyzed current market vulnerabilities and hostile expansion strategies. I laid out a comprehensive quarterly roadmap demonstrating exactly why my encryption algorithms were worth every cent of their new multi-million-dollar valuation. I spoke with absolute confidence, outlining the exact security protocols needed to secure the government contracts. Reginald listened intently, nodding his head in agreement, treating every word I said with the utmost respect. Nia chimed in with legal strategies to insulate the new intellectual property from corporate espionage, her brilliant legal mind perfectly complementing my technical expertise. We were building an empire right there at the dinner table. Through it all, I did not look at the doorway once. I completely ignored the existence of Bradley and Susan Thorne. They were still lingering in the freezing draft of the exit, clutching their ruined clothes. Their teeth chattered loudly as the mountain air blasted against their faces. They were desperately hoping for a final glance. They stood there waiting for a shred of mercy, a moment of hesitation, or even a gloating smirk to validate their presence. They wanted me to acknowledge them, to show that their approval or their suffering still mattered to me. I gave them absolutely nothing. Their absolute irrelevance was the ultimate punishment. I did not raise my voice to mock them. I did not turn my head to watch them suffer. I simply erased them from my reality. They were no longer powerful adversaries to be fought, or parents to be appeased. They were simply ghosts, haunting a doorway they no longer had the right to stand in. While I was actively outlining the integration protocols for Pierce Corp's new security division, the resort manager marched purposefully toward the front entrance. His demeanor was completely devoid of the fawning subservience he had shown the Thorne family earlier that evening. He stopped squarely in front of Bradley and Susan, his posture rigid, his face a mask of professional disgust. "Excuse me," the venue manager stated, his voice sharp and loud enough to carry over the quiet hum of the dining room, completely devoid of any customer service warmth. "You are no longer on the guest list. I must ask you to leave the property immediately." Bradley opened his mouth to argue, his face flushing a deep mottled purple. "Do you know who I am?" he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the manager. The manager signaled to the two massive security guards flanking the doorway. "You are trespassers," the manager replied coldly. "Escort them off the premises." The guards moved with terrifying efficiency. One grabbed Bradley by the arm, twisting it just enough to march him forward. The other placed a firm, unyielding hand on Susan's back, forcing her out of the warm, luxurious glow of the dining room and straight into the brutal Colorado winter. The heavy glass doors slammed shut behind them with a definitive thud. The lock engaged loudly. The aspen air was unforgiving. The temperature had plummeted well below freezing, and the wind whipped violently across the mountain resort's grand entrance. Susan gasped as the icy air hit her exposed arms. She was wearing a sleeveless silk gown meant for heated ballrooms, not a blizzard. Bradley was in even worse shape. The champagne soaked into his suit jacket had begun to crystallize, turning the fabric into a freezing stiff shell against his skin. "Get the car," Susan chattered, wrapping her arms around her chest as she practically hopped from foot to foot. "Bradley, get the rental car. We need to leave before someone sees us out here." Bradley plunged his trembling hands into his slacks. He patted his jacket pockets, his movements growing increasingly frantic. He checked his breast pocket, then his trousers again. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost illuminated by the resort's exterior lights. "I do not have them," Bradley whispered, his voice cracking. "What do you mean you do not have them?" Susan shrieked, her voice shrill and panicked. "It is freezing, Bradley. Unlock the car." I gave the keys to Connor when we handed over the vehicle to the valet. Bradley yelled back, the realization washing over him in a sickening wave. He had the keys in his tuxedo pocket. Connor is in a police cruiser halfway to the county jail. We do not have a car. Susan let out a devastating wail that echoed across the empty snow-covered driveway. She slumped against a frozen stone pillar, burying her face in her hands. "How did this happen?" she sobbed hysterically. "We were supposed to be the parents of a billionaire's son-in-law. We were supposed to live in the Pierce estate. We had everything planned out." Bradley stared at his wife, a sudden violent clarity snapping into place. Decades of denial shattered right there on the frozen pavement. "Because you kept telling him he could do no wrong." Bradley roared, the suppressed anger of 20 years finally exploding. "You bought him every toy, covered every debt, and told him he was destined for greatness, without lifting a single finger to earn it. You created a monster, Susan. And worse, you pushed the only smart kid we had out of the house to do it." Susan flinched as if he had struck her. "You hated her just as much as I did," she cried out defensively. "You told Alyssa her coding was a waste of time. You told her she would never amount to anything. And look at her now!" Bradley spat bitterly, gesturing wildly toward the closed glass doors of the resort. "She is sitting at the head of a billionaire's table planning government contracts, while our golden boy is sitting in a holding cell facing federal prison. We chose the wrong child, Susan. We backed the wrong horse, and now we have absolutely nothing." Susan choked on a sob, having no defense left. They had no money, no car, no hotel room, and their precious social standing was completely annihilated. Just then, the purr of a massive engine cut through the howling wind. A sleek, customized black SUV rolled smoothly up the resort's circular driveway. Its dark-tinted windows and polished chrome screamed extreme wealth. Susan gasped in relief, wiping her running mascara. "They must have called us a car," she said, her delusional entitlement briefly returning. "Reginald must have sent a courtesy car. He would not just leave us to freeze." The luxurious vehicle glided to a halt exactly in front of them. The rear passenger window rolled down with a soft mechanical hum. Bradley and Susan stepped forward eagerly, their hands reaching for the door handles. The man sitting in the back was not a resort concierge. It was Alyssa's personal driver, the same imposing man who had escorted her into the venue earlier. He looked at the shivering, pathetic couple with absolute indifference. He reached out the window and held up a single crisp $20 bill. It fluttered slightly in the freezing wind. "Ms. Thorne said, this should cover your bus fare to the motel down the highway," the driver stated, his voice devoid of any pity. He dropped the bill onto the snow-covered curb right at Bradley's ruined leather shoes. "Have a pleasant evening." The window rolled up seamlessly. The SUV accelerated into the snowy night, leaving Bradley and Susan Thorne standing entirely alone in the freezing dark, staring down at a crumpled $20 bill as their entire world turned to ice. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Aspen Resort's premier penthouse suite. Reginald Pierce had personally arranged the upgrade before his private jet departed for Seattle at dawn. The panoramic view of the snow-capped Rocky Mountains was breathtaking, but my attention was entirely focused on the glowing screen of my laptop resting on the mahogany dining table. My lead attorney, Marcus, sat in his sleek Chicago office, flanked by two junior partners. We were not wasting a single second. The time for warnings had officially expired. "The foreclosure papers are ready for your final authorization," Alyssa Marcus stated, adjusting his glasses. "Your father ignored the final notice of default 30 days ago. He assumed you would never actually seize the family estate. The grace period is over. Once you sign this, the property officially transfers to your holding company. The local sheriff will serve the eviction notice by noon today." Bradley had always treated my financial independence as a cute, harmless hobby. He had gladly taken my money to cover his failing investments, signing over the deed to the Thorne estate as collateral with a dismissive wave of his hand, entirely convinced I would never hold him accountable. He had bet his entire legacy on my lifelong submission. I picked up my customized gold fountain pen. I signed my name across the bottom of the digital tablet, finalizing the document with a sharp, decisive stroke. "Execute the foreclosure." I ordered, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. "I want the locks changed by 3 o'clock. If they left any personal belongings behind, box them up and put them in a storage unit under my name. They can contact my assistant to retrieve their winter coats." Marcus nodded, typing rapidly on his keyboard. Done. Moving on to your brother. The civil suit against Connor Thorne has been filed with the federal court. We are legally freezing all his remaining personal assets, including the offshore accounts we traced yesterday. We are reclaiming the original $500,000 he embezzled from your accounts, plus damages and legal fees. By the time the syndicate and the federal prosecutors are done picking his bones clean, he will not have enough money to buy a cup of coffee in the prison cafeteria. Perfect, I replied, closing the legal file on my screen. Keep me updated on his bail hearing. Not that anyone left in his life can actually afford to post it. As I disconnected the video call, my phone began to vibrate violently across the marble countertop. It was not a single call. It was an absolute avalanche of notifications. The Thorne extended family group chat, a digital space I had muted for years, was suddenly exploding with activity. I picked up the phone, taking a slow sip of my black coffee as I scrolled through the sheer panic. Bradley and Susan had clearly spent a miserable, freezing night in whatever cheap roadside motel my $20 bill had managed to secure them. Now desperation had set in. They were mass texting every aunt, uncle, and cousin we had, spinning a frantic, hysterical narrative. Susan. Please, someone answer. We need help. Alyssa has lost her mind. She had Connor arrested on fake charges. Bradley. I need a wire transfer of $50,000 immediately for a defense attorney. Connor is in a county holding cell. Aunt Martha. What is going on, Bradley? Why are you asking for money? I thought Connor was marrying that billionaire girl today. Susan. The Pierces are monsters. They set our boy up. We are stranded in Aspen with nothing. Alyssa stole our car. Martha, please wire the money. Uncle Robert. Susan, calm down. Why would Alyssa steal your car? This makes no sense. Bradley. Because she is a vindictive, jealous brat. She ruined the wedding. She ruined her brother's life. We need bail money right now before they transfer him to federal lockup. I watched the messages pour in. Aunts and cousins were expressing utter confusion, some offering prayers, others demanding more information before sending a single dime. For decades, my parents had controlled the family narrative. They had painted Connor as the untouchable prodigy and me as the bitter, disappointing outcast. Even now, completely destitute and begging for handouts, they were still trying to cast themselves as the victims of my supposed jealousy. It was time to kill the narrative permanently. I set my coffee cup down. I opened the camera app on my phone and held it directly over the printed copy of the legal document Marcus had just emailed me. The stark bold heading read, Final Judgment of Foreclosure and Notice of Eviction, Thorne Estate. My signature was clearly visible at the bottom, right next to the official county court stamp. I snapped the photo. I opened the frantic family group chat. I did not type a long emotional explanation. I did not defend my actions or argue against their ridiculous accusations. I simply uploaded the high-resolution photograph of the foreclosure document and hit send. The image populated in the chat for everyone to see. Within seconds, the relentless stream of incoming text messages stopped. Aunt Martha stopped asking questions. Uncle Robert stopped typing. Susan and Bradley ceased their frantic begging. The vibrant, hysterical family group chat went absolutely incredibly beautifully dead silent. The silence emanating from my phone was the most satisfying sound I had ever experienced. I locked the screen, slid the device into my bag, and closed my customized leather suitcase with a sharp, definitive click. My business in Aspen was officially concluded. The Thorne family empire had been completely dismantled, and I was flying back to Chicago as the undisputed architect of my own fortune. I pulled my luggage toward the penthouse exit, leaving the breathtaking mountain views behind. The elevator descent was smooth and quiet, offering a few final moments of reflection. For my entire life, I had conditioned myself to brace for impact whenever my parents were involved. I had expected to feel a twinge of guilt, a fleeting moment of hesitation, or perhaps a lingering sense of familial duty when I finally dropped the guillotine on their fraudulent lives. Instead, I felt nothing but brilliant, unburdened weightlessness. The elevator doors slid open to the grand lobby. The resort staff stood at attention. The concierge, who had witnessed the spectacular destruction of my family the night before, offered a deep, respectful nod as I handed my bags to a waiting bellhop. My private driver was already stationed outside, ready to transport me to the airstrip. I stepped through the sliding glass doors into the crisp, blindingly bright Colorado morning. The winter sun reflected harshly off the pristine snowbanks. I walked down the heated stone pathway toward the resort's towering iron security gates. That was when I saw them. Bradley and Susan were pressed against the heavy wrought iron bars. They had not taken the bus to a cheap motel. They had spent the entire freezing night huddled right outside the resort perimeter, clinging to the desperate hope that they could ambush me on my way out. They looked entirely destroyed. Bradley's bespoke tuxedo was stiff-stained and completely ruined from the frozen champagne. He was shivering uncontrollably, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes bloodshot from a night of panicked tears. Susan looked even worse. Her expensive updo was a tangled, frozen mess. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks in dark, jagged tracks, and she had wrapped her arms around her thin silk dress in a futile attempt to stave off the biting wind. Alyssa Bradley croaked, his voice raw and broken as he spotted me approaching. He shoved his hands through the gaps in the iron gate, waving frantically. "Alyssa, please stop. Please, you have to listen to us." I did not break my stride. I walked at a measured, deliberate pace until I stood just a few feet away, remaining safely on the secure side of the barrier. I looked at the two shivering figures who had spent 3 decades making me feel entirely worthless. I felt no pity. "We have nothing," Susan sobbed, pressing her face against the cold metal bars. Her voice was a hysterical grating whine. "Your father's credit cards are completely frozen, the bank accounts are locked. We cannot even buy a cup of coffee, Alyssa. We are freezing. You took the house. You took everything. You have to give us something. Connor needs a defense attorney. They are going to transfer him to a federal facility today. You have to drop the charges." I stood perfectly still, letting her desperate words vanish into the cold mountain air. I did not owe them an explanation. I did not owe them a negotiation. "Please." Susan wailed, her hands gripping the iron so tightly her knuckles turned white. She sank to her knees, abandoning whatever pathetic shred of pride she had left. "Alyssa, we are your parents. We gave you life." I stared down at her, kneeling in the dirty snow. The sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering. "You gave me a life of misery," I stated, my voice echoing with pure absolute ice. "Every meal, every holiday, every single day in that house was a reminder that I was unwanted. You did not raise me. You merely tolerated my existence while you funneled your stolen wealth into a criminal. You bet your entire legacy on a golden child who turned out to be a pathetic fraud." Bradley opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate a defense, but I cut him off immediately. "I built my own empire." I continued, my gaze locking onto my father's terrified eyes. "I built it without your money, without your support, and without your approval. The Thorne estate belongs to me now. Aegis Spatial belongs to me. You are nothing but bankrupt trespassers. Keep my name out of your mouths, or the next lawsuit I file will be for defamation." Susan let out a breathless, choked gasp, completely paralyzed by the absolute finality in my voice. Bradley sagged against the gate, the last remaining sliver of his arrogant composure completely shattering. They finally understood. There would be no negotiation. There would be no financial bailout. There would be no secret reserves of familial loyalty to tap into. I turned my back on them. I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer a final lingering look of regret. There was no grand redemption arc for the people who had abused and discarded me. I walked straight toward the waiting black SUV, the snow crunching softly beneath my designer boots. My driver opened the rear door, offering a polite professional smile. I stepped inside the heated, luxurious cabin, and the heavy door slammed shut, permanently sealing out the sight of my ruined parents begging in the frozen dirt. The tarmac was slick with early morning frost, as the sleek Gulfstream G700 waited, its turbines whining with a low, predatory hum. The private airstrip, tucked away in the secluded valley of Aspen, was a world away from the freezing, desolate gate where I had left my parents. Reginald Pierce and his daughter Nia stood by the boarding steps. They looked like royalty in the high-stakes world of aerospace engineering. Nia was no longer dressed in the cocktail attire from the night before. She was in a sharp, tailored navy suit that screamed absolute authority. She had spent the last 6 hours on the phone with Pierce Corp's legal team, effectively purging Connor's fingerprints from every corner of the corporate infrastructure. I walked toward them, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. My own security team handled my luggage, loading it into the hold. As I approached, Nia met me halfway. She looked at me with an intensity that acknowledged exactly what I had accomplished in less than 24 hours. I have spent years navigating the shark-infested waters of my father's company. Nia said, her voice tight but genuine. Connor wasn't just incompetent. He was a liability who would have dragged the Pierce name into a federal investigation within the fiscal quarter. By exposing him, you didn't just save your own skin, Alyssa. You saved me from a lifetime of cleaning up his debris. She extended a hand and I took it. It was a firm, grounding grip. We aren't just partners on paper anymore, she added, a rare, genuine smile touching her lips. We are the new guard. In this industry, that means something. Aegis Spatial is officially the primary contractor for the entire Pierce Corp satellite division. We are cutting the dead weight and building something that actually functions. Reginald signaled for his security to give us space. He held a thick, leather-bound portfolio under his arm. He had watched the entire Thorne family collapse without so much as a blink, a testament to his own cold-blooded business acumen. To him, the Thorne family drama was just an inconvenience that had been expertly pruned. He stepped forward, tapping the portfolio against his palm. The board of directors is already briefed on the shift, he began, his voice deep and resonant. They are thrilled to be moving on from the Thorne family's amateurish attempts at cybersecurity. We need a partner who understands the nuance of national security, not one who plays games with their daughter's inheritance. He opened the portfolio and withdrew a heavy, high-quality document. It was a formal prime contractor agreement for a massive Department of Defense initiative. I took it, the weight of the document tangible in my hands. The top line clearly stated a valuation of $50 million for the initial deployment phase of Aegis Spatial's proprietary encryption framework. This project is the backbone of our long-term strategy. Reginald continued, his eyes locked onto mine. There is no room for error, and there is certainly no room for the kind of emotional volatility your parents brought to this resort. I scanned the contract, noting the favorable terms. It granted me unprecedented creative and technical autonomy, effectively making me the most powerful woman in the aerospace sector. I looked up at the billionaire and his daughter. The contrast between this dynamic and the toxic, draining environment of my childhood was jarring. There was no manipulation here, no gaslighting, no demands for subservience. There was only raw, calculated meritocracy. I checked my digital pen, ensuring the ink was ready, and prepared to sign away the last vestiges of my life as the ignored Thorne daughter. I was the architect of my own destiny, the CEO of my own firm, and now the most vital partner in a multi-billion-dollar defense conglomerate. To a prosperous future, Ms. Thorne, Reginald said, offering a small, respectful inclination of his head. I pressed the pen to the paper, signing my name across the signature block with a flourish. As the ink settled, I realized the transition was complete. Alyssa Thorne, the daughter of failing grifters, had effectively ceased to exist. In her place stood the woman who had just signed a contract that would rewrite the future of the aerospace industry. I stood there, the document in one hand and my future in the other, feeling the cold mountain wind catch my hair. I did not need a family name to define my worth. I had a defense contract, a vision, and the complete and utter ruin of those who had tried to stop me. The cabin door sealed with a pressurized thud, cutting off the howling wind and the last echoes of my parents' pathetic begging. As the helicopter lifted from the tarmac, the resort fell away, transformed into a tiny, insignificant grid against the overwhelming vastness of the Rockies. I watched the peaks dip and weave beneath us, the jagged edges of the landscape no longer feeling imposing. They were merely obstacles I had overcome. I settled into the plush leather seat and pulled my phone from my clutch. My screen lit up instantly, a relentless stream of notifications mirroring the chaos I had left behind in the snow. I ignored the frantic missed calls from Bradley and Susan, scrolling instead to the top news alerts that had been pushed to my lock screen. The headline was stark bold: an undeniably final tech exec arrested for multi-million-dollar fraud. Below it, a high-resolution photo displayed Connor, his face gaunt and stripped of all the arrogance that had defined his existence. He was handcuffed, being escorted out of a federal building in Chicago by two stone-faced agents. The accompanying article detailed the complete collapse of his offshore accounts and the seizure of his assets. The syndicate had abandoned him the moment the federal net tightened, and the legal repercussions would ensure he spent the next decade reflecting on his choices from behind a wire fence. I swiped the notification away. It was not a moment of triumph. It was simply the inevitable conclusion of a poorly executed con. I navigated to my contacts list, my finger hovering over the names that had once held power over my entire identity. I selected Bradley first. His name stared back at me, a digital vestige of a lifetime of manipulation. I tapped the screen, selected the option to block the number, and watched the entry vanish from my active view. I repeated the process for Susan and Connor. In 3 efficient mechanical motions, I severed the last remaining cords of my past. They were no longer parents or brothers. They were erased, blocked, and permanently purged from my life. The cabin was silent save for the rhythmic, powerful thrum of the rotors. I set the phone aside, feeling a profound, terrifying, and exhilarating sense of stillness. I reached for my tablet, the glass screen cool beneath my touch, and opened a blank design file. The blueprint for the next phase of my empire was already waiting. It was a project that would revolutionize the way we integrated satellite communications into urban infrastructure. It was not just a business move, it was a testament to the fact that I was the sole author of my own success. I began to drag and drop structural schematics, my mind moving with a clarity that was impossible while I had been shackled to their expectations. The steward moved quietly through the cabin, placing a fresh, steaming porcelain cup of espresso on the mahogany side table. The rich, dark aroma filled the small space, a grounding scent in the rarefied air. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the warmth settle deep into my chest. I leaned back, the leather creaking slightly, as I settled into the comfort of my own making. Below us, the mountains were becoming a distant, jagged blur as we banked toward the east, toward Chicago, and toward a future where I answered to no one. The helicopter soared higher, piercing through a veil of clouds into a clear, flawless expanse of blue. This was not just success. This was absolute, uncompromised autonomy. It was the weight of $1 billion empire in my hands, and the absence of any shadows behind me. I looked out at the infinite horizon, a faint, sharp smile touching my lips. It was sweet, it was flawless, and it was entirely, unapologetically my own. The story illustrates that true worth is never defined by the validation of those who refuse to see it. For years I sought approval from family members who viewed me through a lens of prejudice, only to find that my greatest power came from breaking free of their toxic expectations. Realizing that I did not need their permission to succeed was the turning point that allowed me to build an empire on my own terms. Independence is not just financial, it is the courage to define your own value. Have you ever had to choose yourself when others wouldn't comment below?